Chapter 24 covers microbiomes. It's a really interesting chapter on how the microbiomes, the genetic information in our prokaryote and our microorganisms, our protists and fungi, are important in our world. So whether that is some sort of symbiotic relationship or an infection type situation, our microbiomes are very beneficial to our larger complex relationships. We are going to use it just for plants moving to land, which therefore led to animals being able to move to land. And this movement for land was largely dependent on two very important fungal symbiotic relationships. So the reason that we talk about this in chapter 24 is that we really need those fungi to get onto land, for plants to be able to move onto land. So we're not officially doing chapter 24, but we are going to learn a little bit of background information for chapter 24. So about 1 billion years ago, Earth's surface was completely devoid of life. If there was any, it was cyanobacteria in those stromatolite crusts that we saw back in our chapter on origin of life, I believe chapter 22. The origin of land plants preceded the movement of animals onto land. And the reason that plants had to move onto land first is that animals needed a food source. So because animals are all heterotrophs, they have to eat something else. And some of those animals were primary consumers, eating algae and cyanobacteria. Other animals were eating other animals. But in order for anybody to be out of the water, we have to have an energy source on land. And so even though there were some cyanobacteria crusts, that wasn't going to be enough to support animals and their energy requirements. So movement of plants onto land was important for developing soil that was going to support more plants. Land plants were also important for changing the atmospheric composition. So they decreased the level of carbon dioxide, they increased the level of oxygen, which was going to allow for animals to be able to move to land and use that oxygen. Once plants get onto land, we get modern plant communities and therefore plant and animal communities as well. And once those land plants were well established, then of course animals could follow. So colonization of land began around 500 million years ago. Small plants and fungi were the first to move on to land. Those early plants would have been very much algae-like. And as they began to move into different environments, move away from water, they also had to acquire some specific characteristics to live in a place that was relatively devoid of water. In order to do that, plants and animals had to depend on one another. So we say that plants couldn't have moved to land without fungi, but also fungi couldn't really have moved to land without plants. And of course, we need fungi up on land because they are primary decomposers. So they're going to be breaking down all of that material when plants and animals die. About 385 million years ago, we see tall plants, in other words, forests, appear in our fossil record. And as we move through chapter 25, we're going to talk about the adaptations that our plants needed to not only move to land, but also to grow much taller on land. Because until this point, everything was in the water. Nothing needed to be very big. There were some rather large organisms, but outside of water, it takes some very special adaptations to become large. So those tall plants evolved relatively quickly from the very, very small algae-like plants that first moved onto land. So in terrestrial habitats, we have a lot of bright sunlight. This is really optimal conditions for plants because plants require that sunlight. It's bright sunlight, it's not filtered through water. Sunlight energy doesn't penetrate water too far, only a couple of meters. And then after that, you really have to have some special adaptations to be able to acquire any of the sunlight energy that happens to make it that far down. So we've got a lot of bright sunlight. We've got a lot of carbon dioxide because even though our organisms in the water were performing photosynthesis, our cyanobacteria and our algae, a lot of that oxygen was dissolved in the water that is released from photosynthesis. Even if they are taking carbon dioxide out of the water and some carbon dioxide is replenished from the atmosphere, there was still a lot left. So there were really a lot of nutrients available for those plants. In terrestrial habitats now, we've got a lot of nutrients. Those nutrients are there because fungi are decaying and breaking down dead organisms. But initially, there wasn't a lot of nutrients in that soil. So that's going to be an adaptation that has to take place, being able to live in a place with very few nutrients, but then also transform those nutrients so that the later organisms had them available. So there's all these great things about terrestrial habitats, but there are some problems as well. All of that bright sunlight comes with UV radiation, and you all know that UV radiation causes mutations in the DNA, which in people can cause cancer. It can cause damage to the organisms that are exposed to that radiation. And then, of course, water is scarce, so desiccation is a big problem. So any organism that moves to land has to be able to deal with the scarcity of water, and that is going to be one of the big drivers of evolution, is how to deal with that decrease in water availability. And then, of course, we have gravity on land. We do have gravity in the water as well, but the water provides a lot of support for any organism. So this is why many organisms in the water are able to be soft-bodied, because the water provides some of the structure for that organism. And on land, you don't have that. So not only do we have to deal with lack of water, but we also have to deal with that gravity. So we have to have strong, stable structures that are going to allow for organisms to be on land. So movement to land was largely aided by fungi. There are a couple of particular relationships that were especially important. One was lichen. Lichen were important because they help break down those bare rocks into nutrient-rich soil. We also had mycorrhizae that are going to help plants gain nutrients and water. Early land, because there wasn't a lot of nutrient-rich soil yet, had very little nutrients, and of course it had very little water. And so we're going to need those mycorrhizae in our fungi to help plants, as they move, acquire the few nutrients that are actually available. Fungi can become part of a microbiome through the formation of an organism called a lichen. Well, a microbiome is basically a collection of microorganisms, whatever they might be, and their genetic material. So we can kind of look at them collectively, all of the bacteria, fungi, genomes that are present. Lichen are fungi that have formed a symbiotic relationship with a photosynthetic organism. So usually algae, but sometimes cyanobacteria. And so they essentially give these fungi photosynthetic properties. So we've got a couple of examples down here on the bottom. We have crustose lichens, so these lichens on the right-hand side. And then we have fruticose lichens on the left-hand side here. So these are just a couple of different types of lichen that you might find in an environment. In Illinois, we have this hammered lichen. This kind of grayish green color, and then this yellow lichen. This is called hammered lichen. And it's just kind of flat and flaky, and it grows a lot on tree branches. You may have seen this green lichen or something similar to it growing on rocks, especially in rocks that are relatively shaded and often in dry areas. You may not have seen these other kinds of lichen. Lichen tends to grow in very nutrient poor environments, often dry environments, and often cold environments. So there are many species of lichen that are not common here. So you may not have seen all of these. So lichen tend to grow on surfaces that are places other organisms don't grow. They tend to live on dry places. So you'll often see them on rock faces, old tombstones, tree bark, things like that. And the reason that we're talking about them here is that lichen have the ability to break down the rock surfaces. So remember that a lichen is a fungi, and fungi grow by hyphae. And those hyphae are those very, very thin thread-like structures. They can essentially grow through any teeny tiny crevices or cracks in our rocks. We can see some big cracks here, but they can grow through really, really tiny cracks. And when they do, they break up the rocks. They cause the rocks to crack. And then, of course, if you get water into those rocks and it freezes, it expands and crumbles the rocks even more. So by breaking down the surface of the rocks, they are starting the process of soil formation, which was going to be really, really important when organisms were moving to land. And then the metabolic capabilities of the organism that they form a symbiotic relationship can impact what they're able to do. So for example, if we have a fungal lichen that has formed a relationship with a nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria, so this is a photosynthetic nitrogen converting organism, it can increase soil fertility. So as the nitrogen is converted in the rock, from the rock, it is released into the soil when the rock breaks down, and that's going to make soils healthy for our plant life. Lichen are common up in higher latitudes where it's real cold. So this is an example here of a caribou. You might also know them as reindeer, a caribou eating lichen. So it's an important food source in some ecosystems as well. This image shows a cross section of lichen. You can see in this top layer here, we have our photosynthetic algae or cyanobacteria. They're going to be close to the surface because that's where they're going to see the sunlight. And then down below, we've got all of this fungal hyphae. So this lower structure down in the bottom is the hyphae. That's what's going to grow through the rocks or through the soil, whatever its substrate happens to be. If you have the fungi without the photosynthetic organism associated, the structure is going to be quite different because they're going to have to deal with their metabolic needs a little bit differently. But this is just kind of generally what we would see in those lichen. Mycorrhizae and root symbioses are also incredibly important in maintaining the health of plant communities. Mycorrhizae were important in plants moving to land because they helped plants acquire important nutrients. These symbioses are so important that 80% of terrestrial plants have formed mycorrhizae. They are important because fungal hyphae can basically extend the surface area and the reach of the plant roots. So they are going to allow plants to absorb nutrients that they might not otherwise be able to do. So legumes are one type of plant that tends to form mycorrhizae relationships. They form partnerships with soil bacteria that provide fixed nitrogen. So basically those fungal hyphae are going to absorb the nutrients from those bacteria and transport them into the root system. You can see in this image here the fungal body up on top and the mycorrhizae extending down as well. And once they begin to associate with plants, they are going to benefit from the plants as well. Plants benefit because of the increased surface area of the hyphae. That increased surface area allows plants to bring in more water and nutrients from the soil. So besides water, it means an increase in the supply of minerals that could potentially be limiting for that plant. So for example, in many environments, phosphate is a limiting nutrient. So any way to get phosphate into the cell is going to be highly advantageous. Of course, this is a symbiotic relationship, so the fungi have to benefit as well. The fungi receive photosynthetic products from the plant and other nutrients. So when the plant performs photosynthesis, it transfers its sugar molecules to other locations, through to its stem, down into the roots. We can see some roots here coming off of this plant here. And you can see the mycorrhizae, the hyphae, growing around those plant roots. You can't see it too well in the soil, but you can see it growing out here. You can see that it is extending the distance that those roots can penetrate. So that's going to allow the plant to get nutrients and water from a much wider area. And then, of course, it is allowing the fungi to get sugars that it may not be able to otherwise get from the soil, because that plant is going to produce sugars during photosynthesis, transport them down to the roots where the fungi can access them. So there are two different types of mycorrhizae. Generally, you don't have to know the two types, but since we're talking about them, we'll show you here. We've got endomycorrhizae. Endo means inside. So these are mycorrhizae hyphae that grow through the cell wall. These are called arbuscular like arbor, meaning tree, because they form these tree-like structures once they get inside the cell. The other type is ectomycorrhizae. Ecto means outside. So they grow around the plant cells but don't penetrate them. But they can still transfer their nutrients in between those fungal hyphae and the plant roots.